For a decade and a half, I've been a practicing Stoic, but mine is best described as 21st century Stoicism, and I think that's a comment other speakers would agree with. Although my Stoicism is solidly based on the views of the ancient Roman Stoics, it's not my goal to practice the exact kind of Stoicism that they practiced. For one thing, this would be impossible to do, since the ancient Stoics didn't themselves agree on how best to practice Stoicism. Musonius Rufus's practice, for example, was rather more ascetic than that of Seneca. For another thing, my primary interest in the Stoics is their psychological insights into how best to live. They had profound insights into human emotions, and as a result, they came up with strategies for preventing themselves from experiencing negative emotions, such as anger, envy, grief, and anxiety. They likewise came up with strategies for increasing the number of positive emotions they experience, including feelings of delight, wonder, and even joy. It turns out that the Stoics' ancient insights dovetail nicely with psychological research done in the late 20th century, giving rise to what I call 21st century Stoicism. Allow me to explain. Although by job title I'm a philosopher, I have, in the last 2 decades, morphed into a hybrid thinker. I've developed an intense interest in psychology, and as a result, I now read more psychology than philosophy. I'm particularly interested in evolutionary psychology, which attempts to explain human behavior in terms of our evolutionary past. I'm also interested in the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who studied fast and slow thinking. I lean heavily on this research in my own Stoic practice. This approach to Stoicism puts me somewhat at odds with what might be called Stoic classicists. To illustrate our differing views, consider the mini debate that seems to exist regarding the dichotomy of control. Epictetus's handbook opens with the assertion that some things are up to us and some are not up to us. This dichotomy of control, as it is called, is often restated as follows. There are things we can control, such as the goals we set for ourselves, and things we can't control. In my Guide to the Good Life, I divide the second branch of this dichotomy into 2 twigs, as it were. I divide the category of things we can't control into those over which we have no control at all, such as whether the sun rises tomorrow, and things over which we have some but not complete control, such as whether we win while playing tennis. As a result of this tree surgery, I transform Epictetus's dichotomy of control into a trichotomy. There are things over which we have complete control, things over which we have some but not complete control, and things over which we have no control at all. In taking this liberty, I'm tampering with a central Stoic principle. And why, you might ask, would I do such a thing? Because the classical statement of this principle is both logically and psychologically problematic. To better understand the logical problem, consider again the second branch of the dichotomy, which deals with things we can't control. This branch combines 2 different sorts of events, those over which we have no control at all, and those over which we have some but not complete control, into one group, which contains the things that are, as he puts it, not up to us. This grouping seems crude, the way it would be crude for biologists to divide living things into 2 categories, those that are aardvarks and those that aren't. Even if we're willing to live with this logical problem, a second problem arises, one that's psychological in nature. Epictetus's primary goal in stating the dichotomy of control was to help people have better lives by not obsessing over things over which they have no control at all. By stating the dichotomy of control the way he does, he creates the danger that would-be Stoics would stop worrying about things that, in his words, they cannot control. Why bother, for example, to train for an upcoming tennis match if we can't control its outcome? By restating the dichotomy of control as a trichotomy, by distinguishing, that is, between things over which we have no control whatsoever and things over which we have some but not complete control, we can avoid both the logical and the psychological problem. Should you train for the upcoming tennis match? Of course, since it is something over which you have some control. You should train hard, in fact. Should you likewise concern yourself with whether the sun will rise tomorrow? Obviously not, since it's something over which you have no control whatsoever. In much of my Stoic writing, I attempt to play the role of doctor, explaining how, by following the lead of the Stoics, my readers can have better lives. As a Stoic doctor, I'm careful to write my prescriptions in a manner that won't mislead my patients. Hence my reliance on the trichotomy rather than the dichotomy of control. And how, one might ask, would the ancient Stoics respond to this modification of one of their central principles? I'm confident that Seneca, for one, would approve. It was he, after all, who said that, quote, "I do not bind myself to some particular one of the Stoic masters. I too have a right to form an opinion." More generally, I would like to think that if the ancient Stoics had available to them the psychological research that we have available to us, they would have taken great interest in it. Remember, after all, that besides taking an interest in ethics and logic, the Stoics had an interest in physics, more generally in science. I also think the Stoics would be more than happy to reconsider the advice they were giving in light of modern psychological research, if we could bring them forward in time. But having made these remarks, I should add that Stoicism used to be and remains a big tent. There's room for what I am referring to as Stoic classicists. There is also, I hope, room for eclectic 21st century Stoics like myself. And as long as I'm messing with classical Stoicism, let me make another suggestion. This one involves Seneca's bedtime meditation. I assume that most of you are familiar with this meditation, but for those who aren't, here are the basics. At bedtime, when the room was dark and all conversation between him and his wife had drawn to a close, Seneca would review his day, thinking about the mistakes he had made and how he could avoid making those mistakes again in the future. In his essay on anger, Seneca gives examples of the contents of these meditations. Item: he was too aggressive in admonishing someone, and as a result, the admonition simply annoyed the person rather than inducing him to change his behavior. Seneca's conclusion: when criticizing someone, he needs to keep in mind how open they are to criticism and adjust his remarks accordingly. That's very good advice, by the way. Item: at a party, people made jokes at Seneca's expense. The proper Stoic response would be to shrug off these remarks, but Seneca instead took them to heart. His conclusion: stay away from low company. Item: Seneca discovered that someone had spoken ill of his writings. His first instinct was to start treating this person as an enemy, this critic. But then he thought about how many times he himself had made critical remarks about the writings of others. Would he want them to treat him as an enemy? Clearly not. Consistency therefore required that he tolerate their criticism. Item: at a banquet, Seneca was not seated in the position of honor that he thought he deserved, and as a result spent the banquet angry at those who planned the seating and envious of those who got better seats than he did. His conclusion: he had only himself to blame. "You lunatic," he said to himself, "what difference does it make what part of the couch you put your weight on?" And at this point, let me offer a personal aside. I was once asked to finance an extended family gathering at a restaurant, which I was happy to do as long as someone else took care of the details. On the day of the party, I went to see where I had been seated and was a bit surprised because I had been seated not with the adults, but with the children. I felt a flush of anger, but then recalled Seneca's advice. Not only did my anger subside, but by the time the meal was over, I realized that I probably had more fun talking to the kids than I would have had talking to the grown-ups. Bedtime meditations are also are useful, but the way Seneca describes them, they have a negative slant in as much as you focus on your attention on looking for and thinking about your mistakes. As a 21st century Stoic, I would suggest adding a positive dimension to your bedtime meditation. You can, in particular, look for the things that you did right. Did you make proper use of Stoic techniques for dealing with setbacks? Did you, in particular, stay calm and cool as you found an effective workaround for the setback? If so, congratulations. Did you shrug off an insult? Again, good for you. And these are things you can be thinking about. You should also spend time in your meditation thinking about things you can do to make a difference in the lives of other people. In particular, is there someone you should thank for their contribution to your life? And is there someone who would appreciate having a chat with you? And if either of those is the case, thank the person or have the chat. You can also, during your bedtime meditation, count your blessings by thinking about all the things that are going right in your life. This can include your job, your health, your relationships, and so on. Are you perchance taking these things for granted? One final bedtime activity is to think about the positive emotions that I hope you experience during the day. Did you, for example, experience delight and even joy? If you did, is there anything you can do to experience even more of these emotions tomorrow? And if you didn't, maybe some negative visualization in which you imagine the disappearance of something from your life is in order. Let me take a moment to tell you about my journey to Stoicism. I didn't know what philosophy was until my senior year in high school. During that year, this would be back in 1969 and 1970, the good old days, I watched a documentary about British analytic philosopher Bertrand Russell, and I read Henry David Thoreau's book, Walden. If those events hadn't taken place, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you today. In college, I took an Intro to Philosophy course, hoping to further develop my Thoreau-influenced philosophy of life, but soon discovered that American academic philosophers not only didn't have an interest in philosophies of life, they mocked them. I suspect that if I had been bold enough to inquire into the philosophy by which they lived, they would have responded with a blank stare. Thoreau, I concluded, was right to assert that, quote, there are nowadays professors of philosophy, but not philosophers. By nowadays, Thoreau meant the middle of the 19th century. And if those words were true back then, they are even truer more than a century later. And to this day, I agree with his assertion that, quote, to be a philosopher, in the truest sense of the word, is not merely to have subtle thoughts, nor even to found a school, but to love wisdom and live according to its dictates, a life of simplicity, independence, magnanimity, and trust. It is to solve some of the problems of life, not only theoretically, but practically. My philosophy profs were without exception smart, and some were even brilliant. I would be reluctant, though, to use the word wise in reference to any of them. Despite this initial disappointment, I continued my philosophical education all the way to a PhD. After that, in pursuit of a career in philosophy, I stumbled into a tenure-track position at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. And after 37 years, it remains my place of employment. Twice in recent years, they've offered me money to retire. And I think it's so they could replace me with a much less expensive adjunct professor. But I've politely declined these offers because the truth of the matter is I'm simply having too much fun to retire. If you love what you do for a living, it's a mistake to refer to it as a job. It's better described as a passion. Now flash forward. By my 50th birthday, I not only had tenure, but had achieved the rank of full professor, meaning that further promotion was impossible. And what, one wonders, would come after the position of full professor? Truly bloated professor, perhaps? I was, in other words, in a situation in which I could neither be promoted nor, in the normal course of things, be fired. I was getting paid to explore ideas and then share the conclusions I drew with other people, with my students in the classroom and with my readers. Is this a great world or what? But it dawned on me that as a tenured full professor of philosophy, I was one of the intellectually freest individuals ever to roam the earth, raising the question of what I would do with that freedom. Whereas many of my fellow academics spend their tenure simply building on the kind of research that gained them tenure, I decided that I was going to follow a different path. I was going to engage in what I came to think of as outreach efforts. I would write not with my fellow academics as my target audience, but with what might be termed intellectually upscale general readers, people like yourselves. I began doing research on a book on human desire in which I explore the reasons for human dissatisfaction and the strategies that have been developed in the last few thousand years for dealing with that satisfaction. I was particularly interested in the solution offered by the Zen Buddhists. But in the course of my research, I encountered the Stoics, and it quickly became apparent that although the Buddhists and the Stoics shared similar insights into the causes of human dissatisfaction, their strategies for dealing with that dissatisfaction differed dramatically. Zen Buddhists meditate in hopes of having a moment of enlightenment that will set them free. This moment might happen tomorrow, but it might also take decades of meditation to trigger it. Stoics meditate in some sense of the word, but not in the way Zen Buddhists do. And when not meditating, Stoics employ various psychological strategies that are simultaneously easy to learn and easy to use. Negative visualization is one of these strategies. You spend a few moments imagining the loss of something that you value, such as your job, your home, or your children, if you have them. As a result of doing this, you will likely become more satisfied with your job, your home, or your children than you previously were. It occurred to me that although Zen and Stoicism had similar goals, Stoicism had a much lower price of admission, as it were, than Zen. By learning about Zen and putting it to work in your life, or learning about Zen and putting it to work in your life, is a long-term project. By way of contrast, a 3-day weekend is enough time to learn basic Stoic psychological strategies, test drive them, and see whether using them makes a difference in your life. By the time my Stoic research was complete, I realized that Stoic strategies not only worked for me, but that I had clumsily been using some of those strategies much of my life. I was, in other words, a congenital Stoic. And that's how I made my transition from Zen to Zeno. And by Zeno, I mean Zeno of Citium, the 3rd century BCE founder of Stoicism. Much of my research on human dissatisfaction became the book titled On Desire, Why We Want What We Want, which was published in 2006. As soon as I finished it, I set to work on the book that became my guide to the good life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy. I felt that as a newly converted Stoic, I had a duty to share this life-altering philosophy with the world at large. I wrote the guide fully aware that it would be difficult to find a publisher. There didn't, after all, seem to be much of a market for books on Stoicism. And in defense of this claim, let me share a few numbers with you. Go to Amazon and do an advanced search for books written in English with the words Stoic or Stoicism in their title that existed in January of 2008, which is when I was looking for a publisher for A Guide to the Good Life. When I recently did this search, and you kind of do it in a retroactive manner, about 200 titles popped up. That's 200 books about Stoicism. Some of these early modern Stoic books, I should add, were written by people who are at this convention, and including were speakers at this convention. And this includes Sharon LaBelle, Brad Inwood, John Sellers, and Chris Gill. Had it not been for their efforts, it is entirely possible that this convention wouldn't be taking place. In fact, many of us wouldn't even be Stoics. We clearly owe them a debt of gratitude. Many of the 200 or so Stoic books that were available when I was trying to publish Guide were written by the ancient Stoics themselves. Others were written by scholars, but primarily for other scholars. And only a few, including Sharon LaBelle's Art of Living, attempted to introduce Stoicism to general audiences. Now, in order to get a book published, you have to interest a publisher. And in order to do that, you have to submit a proposal in which you not only describe the book you're writing, but provide evidence that you're capable of writing that book. And most important, provide evidence that a market exists for that kind of book, because that's how publishers make their living. As the numbers I've just provided indicate, it was questionable whether there was indeed a market for a book on Stoicism. I therefore proceeded on the assumption that the book I was writing was unlikely to find a publisher, and that if it did find one, maybe a dozen copies would sell, half of which would be purchased by my friends who might or might not read them. But I pressed on, and in the end did find a publisher. And in hindsight, my timing was impeccable. I got in at what appears to have been the ground floor of the 21st century Stoic Renaissance. Rest assured that this timing was not the result of foresight on my part. It should instead be attributed to dumb luck. The magnitude of this Renaissance is breathtaking. To better appreciate it, do an Amazon search for books in English with either Stoic or Stoicism in the title that were published last month. That is, during the month of September. You get about 50 books, meaning that Stoic books last month were being published at the rate of more than one book per day. This is a vastly different literary landscape than existed back in 2008. Most of these new books are self-published, and many of them can be described politely as being basic. Indeed, some of them read like undergraduate essays in need of editing. But you should not take that comment as a put-down of self-publishing. For one thing, these books do play a role in spreading the Stoic message. For another, it would be hypocritical of me to talk down self-publishing inasmuch as I am responsible for two self-published books. The first was a book on rowing, more precisely, a book on rowing those fast but incredibly tippy boats known as sculls. The second was a translation of the writings of Musonius Rufus, who is arguably the fourth most important of the Roman Stoics, the first three being Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus, who himself, of course, was a student in Musonius's school of philosophy. In doing my research for Guide to the Good Life, I discovered that the only available translation of Musonius was that of Cora Lutz. Yale University Press had published it back in 1947, but it had subsequently gone out of print, making it quite difficult to acquire, so I could use it for my research. I described this situation to Professor Cynthia King, my colleague in the classics department, and she agreed that a new updated translation was in order, and I got her to agree to acting as translator while I acted as philosophical editor for the book. When the translation was complete, we sought a real publisher for it, only to discover that none of them thought that there was an appreciable market for the works of Musonius. This was back in 2010. We therefore had no choice but to self-publish. Now, just this year, Yale University Press finally woke from its academic slumbers, and nearly 3/4 of a century after the initial publication, republished Cora Lutz's translation. One reviewer of this new edition commented that because Cynthia King's translation had been published on CreateSpace, that's Amazon's self-publishing branch, it couldn't hope to reach the audience of a Yale offering. Okay, it's time for a few more numbers. This week I checked Amazon sales rankings for the two translations. Ours came in at number 143,000 and Yale's came in at number 350,000. So much for Yale's marketing prowess. And as long as I'm in snide remark mode, one more comment is in order. As a result of self-publishing, Cynthia and I get to keep a far greater portion of the sales proceeds than would otherwise be the case. Once again, is this a great universe or what? Now, I would love to be able to explain the ongoing Stoic Renaissance, but I find the whole phenomenon rather mysterious. There's evidence to suggest that the Silicon Valley was the epicenter of this Renaissance, but it isn't clear why or how it could have played this role. One easy explanation for the current popularity of Stoicism is its hackability. I hate that word, but that's the word to use. It's a philosophy that's easy to explain and easy to disassemble into actionable strategies for living. The same cannot be said of, say, the philosophy of Hegel. But this explanation clearly doesn't get to the bottom of things, since that hackability was there throughout the 20th century, during which time Stoicism dropped off the cultural radar. And before I move on, a cultural aside is in order. In my guide, I take a few sentences to describe what I refer to as stealth Stoicism. I explain to readers that they can test drive Stoicism without anyone being any the wiser. In recent years, I've received emails from people who are puzzled that anyone would feel the need to do such a thing. Why keep secrets, they ask. And indeed, when you look at social media, which I make a point of not doing, you find that the current consensus thinking seems to be, why keep anything secret? I try to explain to these individuals that back in the day, namely way back at the turn of the millennium, it would have been kind of weird to go around telling people that you were a Stoic. Indeed, it would have been a surefire conversation stopper. But all that has changed. These days, it's actually kind of cool to be a Stoic. I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but is this a great world or what? In the time that remains, I'm going to apply Stoic principles to two timely topics, namely current thinking about hate speech and to the challenges presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's do a thought experiment. Suppose we could transport the Roman Stoics forward in time. Okay, I know there are lots of problems and even paradoxes involved in time travel, but play along with me. Suppose that when they arrive and settle in, we start introducing Epictetus and the gang to our culture. As part of this introduction, we might tell them about the ongoing fight against hate speech. We would, to begin with, explain what counted as hate speech. We would include not only blatant racial and sexual slurs, but what have become known as microaggressions, like when you refer to a mixed group of men and women as you guys. We might also go on to explain the way some universities are providing vulnerable groups with safe spaces in which they can be protected from hearing hate speech and in which they can recover from any exposure to it in the outside world. We might also inform them that some countries, including Canada, are fighting hate speech by outlawing it. Our time-transported Stoics would likely be astounded. Not only are such measures unlikely to work, they would tell us, but there's also a good chance that they will exacerbate the very problem that we are trying to solve. Allow me to explain. The question of what should be done about hate speech can be broken into two sub-questions. The first of which is what our personal response to hate speech should be. According to the Stoics, our primary objective should be not to let ourselves get upset by an insult. One way to accomplish this is by simply ignoring it. We carry on as if nothing had happened. Alternatively, we can dismiss an insult in an out-of-hand manner, saying, whatever, turns out to be a highly effective response to an insult. And like silence, it's a response that will probably frustrate the insulter. His goal in inflicting the insult was to upset us. Instead, we have turned the tables and made him look foolish. In using these strategies, it's helpful to keep in mind that in most cases, those who engage in hate speech are not thoughtful individuals. And in some cases, they're the human equivalent of a barking dog. If you let a barking dog ruin your day, you have only yourself to blame. That's what dogs do. They bark. The same is true of your encounters with barking people. According to the Stoics, in order to have a good life, we need to recognize that life presents us with challenges, and we need to take steps to toughen ourselves up so when those challenges arrive, we'll be able to deal with them. One way to do with this is to engage in Stoic training, and I describe this in detail in my book, The Stoic Challenge. In this training, you go out of your way to do things that make you physically and emotionally uncomfortable, just so you can expand your comfort zone. If you do this, then what you find is that an event that would ruin the day of someone swathed in comfort might not even be noticed by a well-trained Stoic. Students in the ancient Stoic schools received this sort of toughness training. I've mentioned that Epictetus was a student in Musonius Rufus's school of philosophy. And during his lectures, Musonius apparently made a point of referring to Epictetus as slave. To put this into context, realize that Epictetus was not only a former slave, but was lame as a result of having been beaten by his master. Musonius's classroom clearly was not what we today would call a safe space. Instead, it was a boot camp for life. Stoic teachers were like tough coaches. Their goal was not to pamper students. Their goal was to toughen them up so they could succeed in the game of life. So much for our personal responses to hate speech. What should our societal response be? I think the Stoics would agree that it's a mistake to shield people from hate speech, and an even bigger mistake to tell them that they have every right to be deeply upset by such speech. Doing these things will only increase the pain they experience on being the target of hate speech. Furthermore, the increased pain will in turn give the haters an incentive to engage even in even more hate speech. It's a vicious circle that benefits vicious people. The Stoics would also agree, I think, that it's a mistake for us to counter-protest at racist rallies. Doing this not only draws media attention to those rallies, but makes the racists look like a besieged group, which can in turn help them recruit new members. Publicly hating the haters might make us feel good. It's also a great way to virtue signal, but it arguably has the unintended consequence of providing oxygen to the fires of hatred. Here's a Stoic plan B. Instead of going out of our way to counter-protest at racist rallies, we should instead just ignore them. Do this and the rallies in question would end up looking like the pathetic events that they are. The Stoics might also suggest that we deal with racists not by having shouting matches with them, but by talking to them, calmly talking to them, and listening to what they have to say. That such attempts can succeed are indicated by the efforts of Black musician Daryl Davis, who has converted hundreds of Klansmen, and the efforts of Muslim woman Dia Khan, who has had similar success both with racists and with jihadists. It turns out that it's hard to hate someone who has treated you with respect. We are currently in the midst of a great social experiment involving hate speech. A world without hate speech would be wonderful, and a world without hate would be better still. The snag is that trying to protect people from hate speech, rather than trying to toughen people up the way the Stoics would do, makes hate speech more potent, which in turn increases the incentive for haters to hate. So are the Stoics correct in their advice regarding the best response to hate speech? Only time will tell, but I suspect that in the coming years and decades, the Stoics will be vindicated. I will end my talk by offering some Stoic advice on how best to deal with the setbacks triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. In my most recent book, The Stoic Challenge, I describe the psychological technique known as framing. We may not have complete control over what setbacks we experience, but we have considerable control over how we frame those setbacks. And by judicious framing, we can minimize the amount of emotional harm they do us. Let me explain. To employ the comedic frame, we use an unpleasant event as the basis for a joke. Socrates did this when someone came up and unexpectedly boxed his ears. "Isn't it a shame," he said, "that when you go out for a walk, you can't know ahead of time whether or not to wear a helmet?" By framing the event in this manner, he prevented himself from getting upset. Another frame is what I call the game frame. And to understand it, imagine that you're running across a grassy field when someone runs up from behind and tackles you, knocking you to the ground. How you react to this event depends on what game you are playing at the time. If you are participating in a cross-country race, you might be traumatized by the event and might even call the police. If you were instead playing a football game, and by this I mean American football, you might respond by jumping up and doing a joyous little dance. You gained 8 yards before they tackled you. Although the physical sensation you experience in these two cases will be quite similar, the game frame will can have a profound impact on how much they hurt you, both physically and emotionally. So it's a very useful frame to have in your arsenal. The frame that I explore in greatest detail in the Stoic Challenge is what I call the Stoic test frame. To use this frame, you imagine that life's setbacks are administered to you by imaginary Stoic gods. They test us not to punish us, but to toughen us up. And to pass their tests, we need to do two things. First, we have to come up with a successful workaround for the setback they've administered. Second, we have to stay calm and cool while doing so. The tests in question, by the way, are self-graded, and grading them is one of the things you can do during your bedtime meditation. I've been experimenting with the Stoic test strategy for years with some curious consequences. One is that I paradoxically find myself looking forward to experiencing setbacks. That sounds strange, I know. But when they come, they give me a chance to develop my skills at dealing with setbacks. In particular, I responded in a positive manner to the COVID-19 pandemic. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't happy that it happened. I couldn't control whether it happened. But when it did happen, I felt like a fireman who had been putting out fires for years, practice fires, without having any real fire to put out. And here I was in the midst of a real fire that I could attempt to put out, at least in terms of its effect on my own life. Another curious side effect of using the Stoic test strategy is that I get a bit nervous when things are going too well in my life. I get a sneaking suspicion that the Stoic odds are softening me up ahead of a significant test, that they're fattening me for the kill. This has resulted in a very much toned down level of celebration when good things happen. I sort of tamper it down there. Be careful. You don't want to make the Stoic gods angry. A third curious consequence of using this technique is that I catch myself talking out loud to imaginary Stoic gods. And sometimes I do it to compliment them for their ingenuity in the test they're currently administering, how they picked exactly the right moment when I was on deadline, exactly the right moment to make my computer crash. And I've also been known to engage in a little bit of low grade trash talk when I quickly and efficiently pass one of their tests. Okay, let me pause here. That the Stoic gods of which I speak don't really exist. I don't believe they do. They're purely imaginary. So why would I talk to them then? Why would I use them? Because it's a wonderfully effective psychological device. And I found that by thinking in these terms, I can, on being set back, keep my frustration and anger to a minimum. Doing this, I might add, makes it easier for me to come up with a clever workaround for the setbacks they impose. Some might argue that a truly rational being would refuse to do that, would refuse to invoke imaginary beings in the way I'm doing. I would argue that a truly rational being will recognize that we human beings are intrinsically irrational as a result of the neural wiring we acquired in our evolutionary past. Furthermore, if somebody were truly rational, he would seek out psychological tools that would let him minimize the negative impact that this wiring can have on his life. A case can be made then that believing in imaginary Stoic gods and even talking to them isn't a sign of insanity and isn't even a sign of irrationality. Now, that said, if the Stoic gods talk back to you, well, that's a different matter altogether. Because it disrupted and even destroyed many lives, the COVID-19 pandemic was a very dark cloud, but it nevertheless had multiple silver linings. One is that it let me work on the ability to discover and exploit silver linings, and let me describe some of those that I found. One is that for lots of people, the pandemic meant lots less time commuting and more time spent with family. And this in turn might have triggered a much needed rethinking of their priorities. Another example, by blasting us out of our usual routine, the pandemic gave us an incentive to discover new ways to spend our time. And I, for one, rediscovered cycling. I started riding a bike for the first time in decades. Another example, by taking things from us, the pandemic revealed how many things in our life we were taking for granted, including, for example, going to baseball games, attending symphony concerts, hugging relatives, attending Stoicon conferences in person, and who knows, maybe sharing a meal with those people afterwards. When life gets back to normal, as it someday will, I hope, people will savor those activities that were taken away. There were silver linings at the economic level. Yes, lots of people lost jobs, but there was also a headline-inducing upsurge in new business applications. For some savvy individuals, the pandemic represented the opportunity of a lifetime. New demands were being created, and they were going to find a way to satisfy those demands. There were environmental silver linings. The air became as clear as it had been in decades, and that kind of woke people up to the fact that it was possible for pollution to be reduced. We could take steps that people wouldn't take it for granted. There's also an interesting silver lining at the public health level. Yes, in health terms, the current pandemic is bad, but it could have been vastly worse. And so this pandemic serves as a kind of wake-up call. And by experiencing it, we are, if we're rational, will take steps to prevent far worse pandemics in the future. The question, of course, is just how rational we are. And based on our recent behavior, there's very good chance that we will respond to this wake-up call by rolling over in bed and falling back into a deep, deep sleep. And with that observation, let me conclude my remarks. I want to thank Massimo, Donald, and Phil for arranging this event. I want to thank the Stoic gods. Special thanks to the Stoic gods for not disrupting it in some kind of test. And a special thanks to all of you in the audience for listening to us, and even more important, for being part of the modern Stoic Renaissance. And in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, I want to present you with a challenge. Let's see whether in coming months and years we can, with our actions and words, transform this Stoic Renaissance into a Stoic pandemic, in which people around the globe, no matter what their station in life, catch the Stoic bug and have their lives transformed by it. Transformed, I might add, very much for the better. Thank you.